Madison, I have to say, I was joking with some old friends of mine, and I said I think my favorite years in journalism happened at the Daily Cardinal when I was a student here at the University of Wisconsin. It was one of those moments where you really kind of just got to embrace what journalism was all about. There weren't a lot of rules. You kind of made the rules as you went along, but you learned how to do journalism, that day-to-day challenge of putting out a newspaper every morning. I look back on those days with a lot of nostalgia, with a lot of fondness, and I think in a more serious fashion, I kind of learned how to be a reporter in those days at the Daily Cardinal. That sense of being critical, of being a little bit skeptical about what you're hearing, of never taking things at face value. These are things that I think a lot of people don't learn at the Cardinal. The Cardinal made it possible for us to get that sense of things. I tell you, I almost look at that from a couple perspectives. I mean, the first perspective was it was rigorous. It was a rigorous education. You went into class, you learned about things, not just the trade, not just the craft of what journalism is about, but the ethics behind it, the philosophy behind it, the history of it. And I felt like I came out as a well-rounded journalist in a lot of respects. The other great thing about Madison, though, was how many opportunities there were for a young journalist to actually write. You had, of course, 2 student newspapers. I did an internship at the Weekly. I was able to do some freelancing for the Milwaukee Journal back then before it joined the Sentinel. When I came out of college, I had a folder full of clippings, and then probably the culmination of all this was a professor helped me get a job at the Associated Press right out of college. So in a lot of ways, I think I owe everything, at least in the early part of my career, to the university. I think there's 2 things. One is language. When I first started I went abroad as a foreign correspondent when I was 25 years old, and I had Arabic at the time, and it was essential. Well, I don't want to say it was essential. It was important. I think these days language is essential. I think it's hard if you're thinking about becoming a foreign correspondent not to have that language is going to be a real disservice to you. I think the other thing that I find, with younger journalists at least, is there's such a focus on being a journalist that maybe some of the younger journalists are losing perspective on the other things that make great stories, and that's history, that's of course language like I already mentioned, a sense of the place, of travel, of experience. I think all these things, when they're rounded together, create better reportage, create better stories, create better journalism. And I think some people maybe have forsaken that for the ambition of just becoming a journalist first and foremost. I had this incredible weekend in March where in April, where on a Friday night I heard that I had won the Pulitzer Prize for a second time. 6 hours later, my wife went into labor. So my editor at the time said, I'm one of those few people who can say that the Pulitzer Prize was the second best news he got in the span of a couple of days, and it's true. My son was born on April 10th, and the Pulitzer was eventually announced officially on April 12th. I think journalism is one of those things where there aren't a lot of rules, where we kind of have to, there's an honor code in some ways. And I think this notion of ethics, this notion of creating some kind of, body of rules in which we can, not regulate the profession, I don't want to say necessarily, but at least, provide some kind of institutional grounding for what we do as journalists is incredibly important. And I think just in my time as a journalist over the past 20 years, I've seen those standards decline pretty remarkably, in fact. And I think especially when you look at foreign correspondence where, there have been things that stories that aren't grounded in reality. So I think that sense of when academia and the professional side of journalism can intersect, can work together to create something a little bit more ambitious. I think it's becoming ever more important. I tell you, I've always thought that one thing I'd like to do after, or even while I'm working as a professional journalist is to teach, is to work with students. I think, it's, again, journalism is so much experience, and to get to share those experiences, to get to talk about those experiences, to try to see the next generation of journalists come up. I think that's always a real pleasure for me.